55. That's the average number of earthquakes that happen on our planet every single day. Now, most of them are tiny, just little whispers we'd never even feel. But they're a constant reminder of the incredible power that's always churning right under our feet. Okay, so to get a handle on those forces, we have to start with the ground we're standing on. Let's talk about the Earth's basic structure, which you can kind of think of as a giant jelly ocean. So imagine the surface of the Earth, the crust, isn't one solid shell. It's actually cracked into these huge continent-sized pieces called tectonic plates. These are our ducts, and they aren't floating on water, they're floating on the mantle, which is the super hot, thick layer of rock that acts a lot like jelly. So you've got giant rock ducts floating on a sea of planetary jelly. You with me? Awesome. Now these ducts don't just sit still. They're always moving, always shifting in what you could call a sort of tectonic dance. And it's this dance, the way they bump and grind and pull apart from each other, that causes all the trouble. There are basically 4 main moves in this dance that we need to know. First up, the separation. Just picture one duct slowly drifting away from another one in the tub. In geology, we call this a divergent boundary. It's simply when 2 tectonic plates are pulling apart from each other. So what happens in the gap when these plates split? Well, this movement usually just causes weaker, rumbling earthquakes. As that crust gets stretched thin, it can form deep valleys or canyons, and it creates an opening for molten rock, magma, to rise up. That's why you often find volcanoes at these boundaries, especially on the ocean floor, where it's constantly creating new crust. The second move is the exact opposite, a head-on collision. Imagine 2 of our ducts smashing right into each other. This is called a convergent boundary, and this is where things get really dramatic. The amount of force in one of these collisions is just staggering. It doesn't just cause powerful earthquakes, it literally builds mountains. I mean, the rock at that junction has nowhere to go but up, so it buckles and folds and creates enormous ranges like the Himalayas. In fact, Mount Everest itself was formed this way. And because those plates are still pushing into each other, Everest is still growing by about 4 millimeters every single year. Alright, the third dance move is the side swipe. Picture 2 ducts scraping right past each other, moving in opposite directions. Geologists call this a transform boundary. The plates aren't colliding, and they're not separating. They're just grinding past each other horizontally. Now, this type of movement can be incredibly dangerous. The plates don't just slide past each other smoothly. Their jagged edges get locked together, and as they keep trying to move, an enormous amount of stress and energy builds up from all that friction. When that energy is finally released, it can trigger absolutely devastating earthquakes. A perfect tragic example is what happened in Turkey and Syria, where the smaller Anatolia plate is basically being squeezed sideways by its much larger neighbors. And that brings us to the 4th and final move, which is often the most powerful of them all. It's another type of collision, but this time, instead of a head-on crash, one duct is forced down and underneath the other one. This is called subduction, and it is an absolute monster of a geological event. Subduction is responsible for the absolute strongest earthquakes on the planet. I mean, just look at the 2010 earthquake off the coast of Chile. It was a magnitude 8.8. And to put that into perspective, it released 37,000 times more energy than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The force was so huge that it physically lifted the entire coast of Chile up by 2.5 meters. Just incredible. So, this all leads to a really important question. We know these plates are moving super slowly, so how does a movement that gradual create such a sudden, violent disaster? Well, the answer is all about stored energy. Yeah, this is the real puzzle, right? The plates are only moving at about the same speed your fingernails grow, maybe 10 centimeters a year. So how in the world does that slow crawl translate into enough power to lift coastlines and flatten entire cities? It's all because of something called the snapback effect. Here, try this. Lock your fingers together and try to pull your hands apart. You can pull, and for a while, nothing happens, right? But you can feel all that energy building up in your muscles. Tectonic plates do the exact same thing, just on a massive scale. For decades, even centuries, they get stuck, locked together by friction, all while continuing to push. They store up an unbelievable amount of stress. And then, all at once, the rock breaks. The plates slip, and all of that stored up energy is released in one violent, explosive instant. That is an earthquake. So, when all that energy is released, it doesn't just travel as one big shockwave. It actually bursts out as two separate signals, two different types of waves that create a very short, very high-stakes race from the center of the quake. The first one to arrive is called the P wave, or the primary wave.